Hello and welcome to Sustainability Uncovered from Edie, the podcast for anyone working in or passionate about sustainability and climate action. Today's episode is a special edition from London Climate Action Week 2026. Throughout the week, the Edie team has been attending events with some of the world's biggest names in sustainability and speaking with some amazing climate leaders. For this episode, we're breaking down 3 of the key pillars of climate action based on conversations we've had this week: energy, cities, and people. Coming up in today's episode, we sit down with Evolve Energy to discuss the state of the energy transition and where corporates can go further to accelerate progress.
Despite what we may do in this sector and how excited we get about renewable energy and the rest of it, voters will always have the final say when it comes to determining who is in power and also who controls energy policy.
Then, the Executive Director of C40 Cities shares how local leaders are leading the charge when it comes to driving climate action.
When we look globally, the per capita emission reduction in those big cities is 5 times the global average, 5 times faster than the global average.
And the Chief Exec of Potential Energy Coalition breaks down the importance of impactful messaging to engage audiences and get them to take the climate crisis seriously.
We don't have a policy problem, we have a communications problem. And so what we're trying to solve is, how do you communicate in a way that you can explain the policies that we need and have sustainable and durable support?
All of that and more in this episode of Sustainability Uncovered. Hello and welcome along to Sustainability Uncovered, hosted by Edie, the UK's longest running business-to-business media brand focused on all things environmental sustainability. So we're just coming up to the end of June 2026 and you're listening to the voice of Edie's acting content editor, Matilda. I'm also joined today by our senior reporter, Sidhi.
Hello.
And our editor, Matt.
Hello.
Once again, we're coming to you not from our home in East Grinstead. We're dialing in remotely because it has been far too hot to convene again in person. And I think we're all a little bit wiped out from running around the streets of London in, 36-degree heat yesterday. So, guys, how are you both holding up as we come to the end of LCAW?
Yeah, I'm slowly just melting away, but it's been quite the distraction, I think, LCAW, from the heat and the poor UK infrastructure to deal with it, which we're all experiencing firsthand, whether that's flats, houses, buses, trains, right? Air conditioning is starting to feel like a bit of a luxury when perhaps it should just be a basic necessity if these are going to become normal weather patterns moving forward. So doing well. Yeah, almost was tempted to actually get us to all go into the office just to sit in the podcast studio, which is probably the coldest coldest building in Sussex at times. So yes, not thriving, but better than just surviving. Yeah.
Yeah, similarly for me, kind of melting away in my very hot London apartment. I was actually thinking about coming to the office just to stay in the podcast studio for like 2 days, but then, the trains are being cancelled, so didn't. But yeah, it's been a really interesting climate action week is what I'm going to say. I think the backdrop of the heat wave has definitely put more pressure onto how the conversations have been accelerating the past few days. It's just something that you can't deny anymore. It's so evident. But then also, yesterday, the carbon budgets have been passed to the parliament, and there were still some MPs that voted no against it. It's interesting because, how do you so evidently deny something that everybody has been talking about for the past few days, and it's impacted productivity, it's impacted health in all ways possible. And then really enjoyed the conversation as well. Although everybody is struggling with the heat when they're out and about, but people have been really nice to each other. I think that's so important to highlight as well. People have been nice, people have been patient, and then the community spirit around LCAW has been one of the most beautiful highlights for me this week. That we all get it, we're all suffering together, but we're here to talk about it and potentially solve it soon.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I don't know whether it was the heat making everyone slightly delirious, but everyone that did manage to turn up despite the train cancellations or just not being able to leave the house with the heat, it's been a very energising vibe, this LCAW. And despite the fact that the weather has made things slightly more challenging, it really does hammer home why we're in these rooms having these discussions. We've been out every single day at various events, have heard some incredible speakers, and it's probably hard to summarise the insights in a 45-minute hour podcast episode, but if I could get maybe a couple of key takeaways that really have stuck with you guys. So Matt, if I could come to you first.
Yeah, I think I had my reservations going into LCAW that it was perhaps a little too big to really mean anything. It was just going to be lots of events hosted around the city, dispersed around a city as well, all talking about the same thing with the same speakers, which did happen in some cases. And it was just going to be this echo chamber that was siloed in different buildings, whether that's air-conned offices or listed buildings, right? But I was quite impressed with the focus on implementation. This wasn't a climate week where everyone came together and kind of patted each other on the back and said, you're doing the right thing, well done, keep going. This was very much, we know the trajectory now. We know it's a net zero future. We know it needs to be a just net zero future. We know it needs to be a kind of closed loop solution to the linear economy. I actually didn't go to any circular economy events, but I know there was quite a few out there. And it was all very much focused on implementation rather than set targets. It's regions, businesses, policymakers who are very much in the kind of reads with this now. They're grappling with the tough stuff of this. I've always kind of maintained it's relatively easy to set a target, but actually delivering it is the hard yards. And I was quite refreshed at just how much the conversations focused on that, certainly around energy and electrification as well. That was the key theme I kind of took. Everyone was obviously talking about the need to electrify, get off gas to respond to energy volatility, but also kind of electrify our hard-to-abate systems so that you can cool our buildings, you can cool our infrastructure to deal with heat waves. And I think the other thing that stood out to me was the diversity of voice across the agenda. And I don't just mean different sectors, but there was some really interesting events. I've seen clips of choirs and singers. I've seen activists kind of take to the stage. We've seen politicians, not just UK, and don't forget politicians that came out hours after our Prime Minister resigned, right? So, there was a time when maybe they would have just said, no, sorry, can't speak. Mayors, and also quite a big European contingent as well, I've noticed. A lot of European businesses, CSOs, policymakers have come here to showcase what they're doing, but also remind us that just because we may have messed up 10 years ago with Brexit, that there is that willingness to collaborate. So I think for me, it kind of dispelled some of my fears that this was just going to be a big echo chamber that talked about the importance of doing this, and then everyone just went back to their day jobs. I still think it probably needs to do more to capture the wider audience. I wonder, if we were to stop how many people, when we went for the edie get together on the Tuesday evening in that bar, how many people would be aware that it's London Climate Action Week? Probably not many. So I think the awareness aspect is there to be worked on. But in general, it was impressive, invigorating. And I think the fact that there is implementation happening at a time when businesses maybe aren't talking about as much is going to stick with me.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Most of the people in that pub on Tuesday were there for the England match. I don't think they were out and about for.
What a fitting analogy that is for climate action. Just a lot of effort and nothing really made happen. The whistle goes and it's the same as when it started, right?
Yeah, it was thoroughly disappointing. Yeah, I think jumping on that, the diversity of voices was really interesting. I mean, there's always these kind of events. There's always, a youth voice or an Indigenous voice, but it's normally kind of, they're their own panel. They're separate. They're at the end of the day. And very much this year, it felt like they were integrated in the really high level conversations where they needed to be. So for instance, on Wednesday, the Net Zero Delivery Summit, which was all finance leaders, there was the Minister of Finance for Turkey was on stage earlier on, and then in a panel on valuing nature alongside the CEO of TNFD, they had Chia Basida, who's a youth Indigenous activist, and her voice was seen as just as important, if not more so, in the conversation around protecting and valuing nature. And I think on that topic, a lot of the conversations this week have been very much focusing on not just what needs to be done in terms of sustainability, but the real value, the real economic business case for being more sustainable, for building resilience in supply chains, building energy resilience, and the kind of concrete financial value that corporates can get from that. Well, not just corporates, but kind of cities in general. And as you mentioned, Matt, cities and mayors and local leaders have been a big focus this year. It's really interesting to see all of those different voices come together. What about you, Sidhi?
Yeah, just echoing to what all of you guys said already. I think for me, adaptation was a big topic, as I mentioned already. Somebody made a comment on one of the panels, and I can't remember what panel or who said it because I have a memory of a goldfish, but the quote said, "Climate adaptation is not an environmental issue, it's a social one." And I think around LCAW would have liked to see more organizations that do not necessarily sit within the bracket of sustainability or green action be there and hear about how it impacts what they do. And then those impacts are only gonna get more intense and severe in the next few years. I also had the privilege of being in the same room in the Guildhall when Al Gore gave his closing speech on day one, and something that he said, which I know is going to stick with me because I do sometimes get eco-anxiety when I see MPs backtracking on policies, or I see reform being voted in during local elections, a party that has famously vowed to cut UK's net zero and climate policies. So yeah, the anxieties can be real. So Al Gore said that if you ever doubt that if humans can muster the political will to actually make these changes and come together, remember that political will is a renewable resource as well. It was really reassuring to hear that. And then, you're in a room and there are hundreds of people. I think the unity aspect of it, I think the way that I felt in that room is probably going to stay with me. But yeah, and then there's just so many great conversations. We've tried to cover some of them in articles and the write-ups that we've written so far across the week, which our readers can follow all of them. If you just go to London Climate Action Week tag on our site or LCAW, you should find all our content in one place there. But it's been a great experience so far, yeah.
And something I thought was interesting that Anne Mettler said in a session on Monday at the Octopus Energy Tech Summit. She's the head of the European Political Strategy Centre, so that's the in-house think tank for the European Commission. She highlighted that energy is 5% of global GDP, but it's the first 5%. So nothing that comes afterwards can come unless we have the energy that's powering all of the systems that we rely on. So obviously decarbonising the world's energy system is the biggest challenge that we face when it comes to decarbonisation. So that was a huge focus of pretty much all of the events that we've attended this week. And to build on that conversation, I sat down with Neil Garland, who's the head of origination at Evolve Energy, to discuss this a little bit more. So here is that interview now in full. Neil, thanks so much for joining. If you could just give us a quick intro into who you are and what your role is at Evolve Energy.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for having me. So, yes, I'm Neil Garland. I head up the origination team at Evolve Energy. I joined the business about 14 months ago, but I've been in the energy sector for about 18 years. So I'm responsible for meeting the business's renewable energy, or electricity specifically, requirements via contracts known as power purchase agreements. So we'll call it PPAs from this point onwards. And the assets that I procure, the ones we have on the books, they range from small scale independently owned solar and other technologies right up to large offshore wind facilities, such as we've contracted through the likes of Shell Energy Europe, with whom we have a long-term structured trading agreement with. So again, we operate in both the small end and the large end nowadays. In terms of past as well, I've had the benefit of working for large industrial and commercial businesses, including Hovis and Jaguar Land Rover. And I've also worked in consultancy and clearly now in supply. And I think that experience has given me a lot of excellent insight into three of the key facets of the industry.
Perfect. And I know you've also been out and about at various events this week, braving the heat outside. How would you describe the mood at LCAW this week? Do you think that businesses are approaching the energy transition with confidence, or are you kind of sensing some hesitation given, the current economic and political landscape?
Yeah, sure. I would say the tone is or was definitely different to past events I've attended. Again, I've been doing them for quite a while, different topics admittedly in energy, but definitely different mood to what I've seen even in the last sort of 12, 24 months. I'm not sure I would call hesitation, but I would say the mood was more measured. And that definitely came across with some of the topics and interactions between the speakers and the audiences. And I saw that across multiple events that I went to. And a key thing that came up, apart from some big ticket items we'll get into, no doubt, there was a recognition that, one, we can't just purely think about reducing emissions. We have to take the public with us. And energy pricing, especially at the moment with the backdrop of several wars, of course, has put the worst off in a very difficult position. And actually businesses too, for that point. We actually had the view of Chris Stark, who's the head of Clean Power at DESNZ. He said quite openly, I was quite impressed with this actually, he's not happy one bit with energy prices and they need to be lowered. And I would agree with that. We also had at one of the talks I went to, Laura Sandis, who's chair of the Green Alliance. She said, and this was actually something I thought, we don't include the customer in our discussions enough. And actually very few of the discussions I heard across a number of different topics mentioned the customer. Her whole speech actually was about the customer. She actually put a slide up, which I thought was quite amusing really. And it said, citizens have a veto on net zero. I think the point she was making there was remember that despite what we may do in this sector and how excited we get about renewable energy and the rest of it, voters will always have the final say when it comes to determining who is in power and also who controls energy policy. So we need to bring those voters with us at all times.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one thing, the energy industry having these conversations with each other, but if the customer's not on board, then nothing's going to change. So what conversations or themes have stood out to you most this year?
Well, I would say there's two key themes that I picked up on. The first one was one of the speakers at Reset Connect went to mention that a sustainable business, if they actually partake in sustainability, they can see as much as a 10% improvement in brand value. And I thought that was really interesting to hear because that's something that we've spoken about, whereby you can improve your market cap, your share price, by putting good news out and timing the good news at the right time as well. So by demonstrating you are a sustainable, ethical company, you're buying ethically, renewably, that can actually have and attract additional values to your brand. So that's not purely about an emissions play there. But she did also say that companies need to manage this in the right kind of way. You need to manage your comms. So it needs to come across as credible and authentic. It needs to be woven into the brand's DNA. It can't be a bolt out of the blue, so to speak, as I know some companies have tried to do. And ideally, it needs to have some form of local resonance as well. So what I thought was meant by that was if you're operating in different markets, you need to make sure that that articulation, that communication is actually worded in a way that sounds authentic to that given market in that country. So that was good to hear because, again, we've been championing that sort of same opinion already by, effectively, if you do more sustainability, it's only a good thing for your brand value. The other one would be AI. I mean, AI was everywhere. It dominated the events I went to. Interestingly, and I guess it probably depends on who you work for and your viewpoint, but it seemed to be presented as both a challenge and an opportunity. So, for example, you had the head of sustainability at NVIDIA who was arguing that AI could resolve a lot of our problems and help us to decarbonise faster, because effectively they have immense flexibility at their AI data centres where they can shift loads upwards or downwards, or even move compute to different parts of the country, or even different countries it would be, which I thought was quite interesting. On the flip side, when you think about what's coming down the line, the planned growth is staggering. We have the Director General for Infrastructure, Ofgem, talking about the fact that we have 125 gigawatts of connection requests planned for the coming years. So across 2030, 2035, we have that level of volume coming down the line, and apparently about 80 gigawatts or slightly under 80 gigawatts will be AI data centres alone. Now, if you compare that to the very highest peak capacity we've ever seen on the UK grid, that was just shy of 60 gigawatts. So basically, we're talking about a grid within a decade, which is around 3 times the size, and that is remarkable. It really is. Be interesting to watch what happens there.
Jumping on to my next question, the UK has made strides in renewable energy deployment, whether that's solar and or wind. We've hit record levels of deployment in the last few months. But what do you think are the biggest challenges that still need to be addressed to unlock even faster growth?
Yeah, I mean, if you'd asked that question maybe 2 years ago, I would have said immediately without hesitation, connections reform was needed. And that was coming anyway, to be fair. We're now seeing the benefits of that. And again, not someone who is applying for connections anymore, have in the past, but from what I was seeing at the event, what I was hearing, the signs are positive early on. So what's happening for the benefit of the audience is effectively a lot of these speculative applications which were going into the queue are now being removed. And that in turn is helping to reduce waiting times. They're by no means perfect, and we actually had at Earthfest one of the panel discussions that was actually between a number of Chinese professionals, one who worked for Jinko Solar, which, as I found out, I knew the name, but they produce 1 in 10 of all the solar panels globally. They actually can effectively get things through within as little as 3 months, and that's from design to build. That's the best case, I think, really there. Another issue that we have still, I don't think it's resolved, is lengthy planning permission processes. So, and a lot of NIMBYism, of course, as well, because we are, unlike China and the US, who are doing solar and other technologies at scale, We do have quite a geographically constrained country, so of course you're going to get issues around NIMBYism. And again, to bring it back to my earlier point around bringing the public with us, I know from my own experience, because there's a solar farm which is possibly going to be built down the road from me, that a lot of people don't understand them and don't see the benefits. And there is that kind of friction, at least from a perception point of view, is, well, if you're building a solar farm on what could be used for crop, arable land, what about food security? I mean, energy security is one thing, but food security is also important. So we have to deal with those sort of issues anyway. The other thing as well, I would just say finally, is you've got the CFD subsidy, the only subsidy now that really exists for renewable generators. That only supports the medium and larger generators out there. And with many concerned generators out there who I speak to regularly around our own FIT schemes coming to an end in the near future, we need to think about how we can support smaller generators. So one of the things that we can support with effectively is providing license-exempt supply PPAs, peer-to-peer as we call it as well, where effectively generators who produce up to 5 megawatts per hour can supply energy to matched off-takers, so they get a benefit as well, and they can share in an additional revenue source.
And speaking more broadly in terms of the renewable energy market, what are some of the biggest changes currently or coming further down the line that companies should be paying attention to right now?
Yeah, I suppose one thing to sort of say broadly is businesses should be comfortable with high prices, unfortunately. I think they're here to stay now, and we've not seen low prices for quite a while now. I mean, COVID was probably a slight blip, but the high prices of old, we're now pretty much there. That's kind of our low point now. So I think companies should be thinking about taking longer term contracts out. So previously, and I've pitched to many businesses over the years, previously doing contracts which were multiple years beyond 2 or 3 was seen as a no-no, and a board would probably not approve that, including, funnily enough, some of the ones I've worked for. Getting things signed off above 3 years was very difficult to do. But now, because of the high prices, taking out a long-term hedge, even a partial hedge, is seen as beneficial. And that's aside from the renewables or ESG angle. In terms of other updates, there was actually something put out by Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, in April. It was a speech, and it was paving the way for a consultation that should happen by the end of this year. He put out a couple of key things, which were, one, they're looking to, subject to consultation, of course, decouple the renewables market from non-renewables for fossil fuels. So we'll see how that pans out. I'm not entirely sure yet, because we haven't had the consultation and seen it yet, but in principle, it should insulate people who are buying renewable energy away from fossil fuel price shocks, which is kind of what we're experiencing at the moment, really. And I think the other thing as well, it would allow customers increasingly to be able to say with greater credibility, I am buying from renewable energy sources, rather than I'm buying what I think is renewable energy because it's got REGOs, but are the REGOs really from the source of power that they're buying it from? That's been a topic for debate. Greenwashing is the accusation there for many, many years. So that could help that anyway.
And you've touched on this a little bit already, but corporate PPAs traditionally have been seen as something that only kind of the largest global companies could access. But how is that changing, and what opportunities are there out there for mid-sized and smaller businesses?
Sure. I mean, having done CPPAs before and spent a lot longer talking to people about them, I can speak from a point of experience on this. First of all, they're not the only option available for people. I think previously they were considered to be the only option in a world perhaps where the alternative would be to buy brown energy and you match REGOs with the pitfalls mentioned earlier on. Now there are other options to buy certifiable and authentically renewable green via the grid. Of course, you can generate your own power as well. So we have a proposition called ESG Accelerator. We do peer-to-peer arrangements. I mentioned license-exempt supply earlier on as well, where, again, you've got the financial opportunity, but you also, by the very nature of how to achieve that, you have to match renewable generation with off-takers on a half-hourly basis. So you get into that world anyway. We have the ability to offer, for example, things like renewable consortiums as well, again, which can leverage license-exempt supply, the peer-to-peer thing as well, where you've got multiple diverse renewable generators, which all complement each other as well, because solar and wind work quite well together. Hydro, again, probably supports solar. Edie is quite flat. So all these technologies together provide a more flattened shape, which complements and can support diverse customers on the other side as well. And with those type of products as well, unlike corporate PPAs, one, you don't need the investment grade credit rating or parent company guarantee or something of that ilk, which immediately for a lot of customers just cuts them out of the conversation. Although I wouldn't say PPAs are by any metric simple, they are far simpler. Corporate PPAs can take many, many years to negotiate. In fact, 1 or 2 years, certainly. These sort of arrangements, we're doing them right now. I mean, you can have them signed up within a matter of days, possibly even the same day if you're quite keen on doing it.
And organisations of all sizes right now, decarbonisation is a priority, both in terms of cutting emissions and building energy security. But a lot of them just don't know where to start. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions or the biggest barriers that you encounter when you're speaking with these businesses?
Yeah, sure. Starting off with the CPPA again is probably the key one there for me. So again, I've spoken to a lot of businesses, including names you would recognise, so big corporations who certainly a few months ago, perhaps even up until this day, wanted to understand what was involved to go corporate PPA, maybe thought that was the only route to getting traceable green power. But the moment they started to hear about it, because it is a bit of a buzz term, it was certainly, I think AI has probably taken over now. But when they started to kind of really get under the bonnet and understand what was involved, again, you need to be generally investment grade, and so Moody's or Standard & Poor's, triple B plus, something like that. Additionally, there's a heavy resource requirement. Now, that's not just necessarily money, that's also time and energy as well. But it could be legal costs, because not every company has the legal capability to kind of grapple these things internally. So CPPAs being easy and being the only thing to go for, that's probably the key one there as well. I think also, I would say you need to be working with the right kind of TPI. Now, we work, not exclusively, but we work heavily with TPIs. And let me just say this, in the broadest respect, because I've worked for TPIs as well, not all TPIs are the same. Some will be far more tuned into the renewables market and how to get, again, certifiably renewable energy. Some will be very much at the early part of that journey. And don't get me wrong, we'll work with them as well in terms of trying to help them out. But I think from a corporate's point of view, because the vast majority of companies, even the large ones, work with TPIs, make sure you've got one who knows what they're talking about and has your best interests at heart and knows all the different range of options out there, including both on the demand side, but also on the PPA, the generation side too.
And looking ahead over the next 3 to 5 years, what developments do you think would have the biggest impact on corporate clean energy procurement?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious ones are going to be, from a political point of view, things change, and that may force or change legislation and policy more broadly. Then that's clearly something that, at the moment, we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what changes could come. And unfortunately, when you're deciding upon long-term energy policy or strategy, the fact that governments are only in there for 5 years isn't really helpful, but it's just something we have to deal with. I think it's got to bring it down a little bit more to sort of a granular level. I think I've not been in procurement working with big companies for a few years now, but I could see the way that things were going because I was actually doing it to my suppliers. Increasingly, one of the requirements put on suppliers feeding into retail or any other industries is you're part of their scope 3 emissions. So you need to be helping them to meet their own climate goals, as it would be. So the tenders I was sending out, and many companies are sending out to this day, they have a strong renewables or climate part to them. So you may be the best in terms of providing the service or the cheapest in terms of unit costs. But if you're not competitive in regards to how you're buying energy, is it authentically renewable, and how are you supporting, again, that company's supply chain to help them to decarbonise, then you're probably going to get ranked down. So I think we're going to see more and more businesses who either want to or feel compelled to move into the world of 100% renewable time-matched energy, moving into that area. That's one thing, definitely. I think we'll see more of license-exempt supply and it become widely known about. It's certainly getting there through our work, but also it just seems to be known about P442, which was one of the modifications that we put through to help us to do this at scale. That's now become increasingly known about. It was actually at the British Hydropower Association for the second year in a row. I did last year and somebody else did this year on that very topic. I think we'll see, and this is one of the themes of London Climate Action Week as well, we'll see an increasing amount of community power arrangements. There are a number of talks attended on this actually this week, and prosumer arrangements. They're kind of similar. Let me explain. So basically the idea there is effectively you've got demand and generation known to each other and you're kind of sharing the glory as it would be. And there's often a good story there as well. So cheaper energy for people. You can also benefit from license-exempt supply as well because you're matching, clearly. I think another area that I believe will see significant improvements will be the area of flexibility. So where effectively consumers are incentivised to generate their own, maybe store their own power and to provide that power back to the grid when it's constrained. So I think that's a proposition that excites a lot of people because it may give them the opportunity to effectively completely remove or reduce their energy bills down to the bare minimum. And of course, they're doing it with authentically green energy as well. And I'm aware of the fact it's being done certainly in the domestic market at the moment, but I don't see any reason why we can't see that applied also to the commercial sector and the public sector as well, so schools, universities, maybe businesses too. And I can't see any reason, again, even if you're not entirely bought into the climate side of it, the fact that it's saving you money and you can avoid some of the price shocks of experience, I don't see why you wouldn't consider it.
Yeah, for sure. And just before I let you go, if you could take one message from this week's discussion, so whether that's conversations you were a part of directly or you overheard, if you could take one message directly into UK boardrooms, what would it be?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I will answer that in two parts. So first of all, as I heard one of the themes, I would say that sustainability is not purely about reducing emissions. That's the first point there. And one speaker who was head of sustainability for a large corporation, she made the point that it was a hidden opportunity. I don't think I agree with that. I think the cat is somewhat out of the bag now. The way I describe it is it's a multifaceted opportunity. So there are a number of different benefits in terms of doing this. So first of all, as I said earlier on, sustainability can give businesses a competitive advantage, or at least allow them to remain competitive in a more challenging market, because again, some of your customers may be making demands as part of tenders. So if you don't comply with their demands in terms of demonstrating you're buying authentically green energy, then you may actually find out that you don't make the cut anymore. And even though traceable renewable energy is a scarce commodity, there's no two ways about that. And we've got obviously AI data centers, which will be taking a heck of a lot of that. It is, in terms of the ways to contract with it, it's more accessible in that regard. So gone are the days when lengthy, complex and resource-intensive CPAs were the only show in town. They're still there for a select few businesses who need them. But businesses, including at the smaller end, medium-sized businesses too, have other ways to engage with renewable energy, such as, I mentioned it already, but you've got license-exempt supply peer-to-peer arrangements. There's also renewable energy consortiums where you can have multiple demand customers and multiple generators all put together and matched on a half-hour by half-hour basis. And then finally, we have our own ESG accelerator proposition too. And you can find out more about that if you go to www.evolve-energy.com. There's more information there, and you can actually have your own assessment done.
Well, that's all we've got time for today, but thank you, Neil, so much for taking the time to chat.
Of course, well, thank you for having me.
Thanks very much again to Neil and the Evolve Energy team for their time. We're going to take a really short break now, but don't go anywhere, because next up, we'll be talking with Mark Watts, Executive Director of C40 Cities, which is a network of nearly 100 mayors from the world's leading cities. It's headquartered in London, but it's working to deliver urgent action to confront the climate crisis across the globe. Hello and welcome back to the Sustainability Uncovered podcast with me, Matilda, Sidhi and Matt. So we've covered the energy that powers our world, but what about the communities and political structures that organise the world as we know it? As we've mentioned, cities were a central theme at this year's LCAW, and to dive into that topic a bit more, I managed to catch Mark Watts, the Executive Director of C40 Cities, to learn more about some of the amazing things local leaders are doing across the globe. Here's that conversation now in full. Okay, so I'm here with Mark Watts. So Mark, thanks so much for joining after what I know was a really busy day, very hot. Just to start off, in terms of driving climate action, what role do you see cities playing, and where are you seeing some of the most promising examples of urban leadership?
Well, I think we can see it here. We're seeing real dynamism, consistent leadership and demonstration of ability to collaborate coming from city leaders, which obviously the world needs. The numbers speak for themselves. Just for our member cities in C40, which is 100 of the sort of biggest, most influential cities in the world, 3/4 of them are now cutting their emissions faster than their respective national average. Perhaps more important is when we look globally, the per capita emission reduction in those big cities is 5 times the global average, 5 times faster than the global average. I mean, it should be. There should be leadership. So we definitely see that writ large. We've had some great examples of individual city leadership here. I was just talking about, in fact, what Rio has done, who's not here, but having gone from some really serious heat-related deaths only a few years ago to now having a world-leading early warning system in the city that is preventing the deaths from the climate breakdown that's inevitable. To the other side of the world, the Mayor of Melbourne's here, Nick Rees. He's both just launched a data centres pact, which I'd love to talk about later. But also, when I was in his city a few weeks ago, 40% of the homes in Melbourne now have solar PV on the roofs. They're now starting to match that with batteries. Huge sort of shift to renewable energy in a country whose economy has been largely based on the sale of coal and gas.
Yeah, and you touched on this already, but how have you seen the shift in focus from just climate mitigation to adaptation? Because obviously, as we know and as we're experiencing right now, extreme weather, extreme heat is becoming more and more of an issue. Have you seen the balance shift a little bit in terms
Very
of...
much. Yeah, very much. And again, in the numbers, we log each year how many of our member cities report any climate-related extreme weather events. 10 years ago in 2015, it was 1 in 20 cities. Last year, it was 1 in 4. And this year, with the Super El Nino, I wouldn't be surprised if we're getting close to every single city. And that's reflected in when we talk to our members about what they want C40 to focus on. There's been a surge of initially flood-related, drought-related. Now, heat is absolutely the top issue. And I think now one has to just respect the fact that we are in the era of climate breakdown. It is happening. It is going to get worse. But that doesn't mean that the level of human suffering has to increase on the same sort of linear scale. Because we see the cities that have taken really strong action with good early warning systems, increasing shading, etc., where actually the hazards are going up, but the deaths are going down.
You've touched on some of these amazing, potentially life-saving initiatives, but those can't come out of nowhere. Most of them require quite a lot of investment up front, and access to finance is a huge barrier for companies and for cities. So what changes do you think need to happen in order to unlock climate action, unlock climate finance at the scale that cities require to protect millions and millions of lives?
Well, I don't think there's any lack of finance. It's just not going to the right things.
Right.
So we're still seeing funding flowing into cities for luxury housing when we need affordable housing. We saw this year record investment by the big banks in the fossil fuel industry when there should be zero investment in new exploitation of fossil fuels. I think also at the city level, we've got all the examples of how cities can generate the kind of investment that's needed from the green bond issuances that are often massively oversubscribed. We heard the president of the Ile-de-France region on the stage just now saying 3 times oversubscribed for her green bond. It was the same in Joburg, it was the same in Mumbai, but just not enough cities have the ability to issue those green bonds. So we need to universalise those abilities. But I also think we really need city governments and all levels of government to use all the levers at their disposal. We should be past the era now, that failed era of seeing the role of government just to intervene when the market fails. It's too late by the time the market fails.
Yeah.
We need governments that want to create and shape markets, want to invest in the parts of the economy that are going to produce the infrastructure, the goods, the services that we need, that people need, and including that public ownership of investment, which is so critical. So that's a big sort of focus in C40, and starting from every city having a climate budget, so that when they set their annual financial budget, it's got to demonstrate that it will deliver the carbon reduction target for that year, so that truly every department, every bit of procurement, every part of investment is being utilised.
And part of investment and bringing capital to cities lies in the businesses that are there or aren't there. And a lot of businesses, they recognise that their own climate ambitions, that's based heavily on where they operate. So what are some of the most effective ways that companies and city governments can work together to accelerate decarbonisation and resilience?
Well, I think the stuff mayors have been talking about data centres a lot here this week, because suddenly we have mayors saying half of all the planning applications on their desks are for data centres, threatening to overwhelm the planning system, but also potentially undermine carbon targets and overwhelm water supply. This is an extraordinary, unprecedented level of investment flowing into artificial intelligence and the data centres that serve it. We need the companies, and some great companies we work with, to sit down with the 40 plus mayors today who've launched a global urban data centres pact, setting out we want the data centres to be in the right places, on the brownfield sites, not taking up the space that should be good housing. We want them to be powered by renewable energy. We want them to not put extra demand on water systems. We need businesses that want to co-design with city government, actually, I think it's got to start from really strong regulation. The public sector has got to regulate, so the businesses that want to do the right thing, want to help us get over the climate crisis, make the green transition, it's profitable for them, it's easy for them to invest. We've got to make it hard, difficult and expensive for the companies that want to carry on selling the wrong things.
No, absolutely. You've spoken about the data centre pact. There's been a lot of amazing announcements just today, let alone over the course of the rest of the week. So as delegates finish gathering for LCAW, what gives you the greatest reason to be optimistic? And on that tangent, what's one action that you want delegates to take away from this year's LCAW?
I always feel positive when I'm in a room with a load of mayors, which it's part of my job. But this week it's really made me feel optimistic, because the sense of shared purpose, collaboration across all different geographies and cultures and levels of economic development. But what I really like here is this is by far the biggest London Climate Action Week, when the geopolitics is dead against us. But people are not hiding, they're coming together, and my constituency is mayors, but there's amazing business leadership here. We've a load of really brilliant national government leaders here from Brazil, from Germany, just been on a stage with them. Civil societies here in force, and philanthropy is really sticking with us behind the climate organisations. I think we should feel confident, and we heard from the UN Secretary General. We're winning on one side of things here. Clean energy is now the cheapest energy in the world, and it's easy to install, and it really helps overcome some of the biggest risks, particularly energy security and affordability that people are facing. The thing I would like to be different as a result of this is, let's start with every layer of government doing what the C40 and GCOM cities are doing, which is now saying, we're not talking about commitments for 2040, 2050, we do yearly offers of action. What we're going to do in the next 12 months with the resources that we're committing right now, and come back in a year's time and we'll tell you how we did on it, and then we'll tell you the next year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, setting long-term targets is hugely important, but it does kind of allow you to lose focus along the way. Speaking of shorter-term targets, if we were having this conversation again in, say, 5 years' time, what do you think success would look like for cities in the global climate transition?
Well, I think we'd have to recognise the impacts of climate breakdown are inevitably going to have been a lot worse over the next 5 years. But what we've got to aim for is that doesn't mean more deaths, more human suffering, more biodiversity loss, but because we've invested fast and in a very big way to make cities, places where most people live, more resilient. And we see that in the numbers in C40. The places that put in the early warning systems have increased their tree cover and shading, that have invested in more water storage. Yes, the hazards have been greater, the extreme weather events have been greater over the last decade, but the number of deaths has gone down in most cases. So, number one, that. Two, in 5 years' time, we've got a target that will have halved the use of fossil fuels in C40 cities from 2020 to 2030. I think that can still be achieved.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll catch up in 2031 to see if that is the case. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your London Climate Action Week.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back to the Sustainability Uncovered podcast. Next up, another pillar that underpins climate action are the people within these cities. As much as policy can shape where the climate movement is going, it's the people that do or do not respond to that policy that will ultimately change the course of the climate crisis, help to tackle global warming and keep emissions under control. So, Sidhi, you sat down with John Marshall, who's the chief exec and founder of the Potential Energy Coalition.
Yeah, I did. We weren't really sitting down. We were recording the podcast in a dodgy alley somewhere in London. Yeah, but the conversation with John was really interesting because, lately we've been hearing that the one thing that the sustainability action has not got right is the comms around it. And that's why it's so easy to spread misinformation, to twist facts. So the conversation with John was interesting. We talked about the jargon that kind of exists in this sector and how we can reduce some of that jargon while keeping the science intact. I think that's something that a lot of people can struggle with. So the conversation does provide a lot of actionable insights that business ESOs, but then also policymakers can take on to bring more people into, I think, what some people call the sustainability bubble, which shouldn't be a bubble. So yeah, great conversation.
Yes, I was eavesdropping that conversation, and it was, despite the location, it was very interesting. Here's that conversation now in full.
Hello everyone. For this next segment of the podcast, I'm speaking to Potential Energy's Chief Executive, John Marshall, about a very key element of climate action, which is people. There is no action without people, bringing people together. So for those of our listeners who may not be familiar with Potential Energy, could you please provide a brief introduction, John?
Absolutely. Think of us as a marketing firm for planet Earth. I had a 30-year career in management consulting and marketing, and one day my 17-year-old kid said to me that I was a useless idiot for selling soap and shampoo, and so we formed this nonprofit marketing firm. And initially we brought together a whole series of many of the world's best marketers, and noted there's a lot of potential energy in the industry, and if we could purpose it on helping to sell the solutions to climate change, could we make a lot of progress? So that's the origin story, and for the last 6 years we've been running marketing campaigns to get citizens aware of the issue and try and create greater support for policy.
That's incredible. Sorry your son said that. Potential Energy is such an interesting name. I was wondering if there was a story behind it.
Right, that story was we got about 100 CEOs of different marketing firms and ad agencies together to talk about, if we brought the power of the marketing and advertising industry on the issue, could we make a lot of progress? And one of them noted, well, there's a lot of potential energy in this room, and someone else said, you should call it that. And so that was the origin story behind the name.
That's a really cool story. So bringing the conversation to what's actually happening out here, public's attitudes towards net zero, climate action. There's a recent research that you published that says 90% of UK adults say climate change is real and it is happening, which is a very promising statistic. And 72% support immediate government action. But recent local elections have seen a rise in the popularity of parties that have openly vowed to gut the UK's net zero and climate policies. Why do you think there's a gap between what people want versus what they're voting for?
Yeah, so we just completed, we do a whole range of analytical work. Over the last 6 years, I think we've done hundreds and hundreds of different studies. And we just completed a major study with 6 countries in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. We surveyed 83,000 citizens across basically the G7 and learned a whole series of things. I think to your question, what the data is telling us is we don't have a policy problem, we have a communications problem. And so what we're trying to solve is how do you communicate in a way that you can explain the policies that we need and have sustainable and durable support. And it turns out that the data says that many of the ways that we've been currently communicating make it easy for the contra messaging to be effective. But if we chose better messages, we would get better support. Our view is that we shouldn't view any election as an edict or a mandate about climate action. People are going to vote for the things that they care about, and the opportunity is to position climate in a way that relates to people's everyday concerns. And so the data is really clear that climate actually is a winning issue. It actually is something people care a lot about. But when we position it in ways where we use complex terms or big global transformation or it's too ideological, we lose support really easily. When we positioned it in normal and understandable terms or around regular day-to-day consequences, it's actually significantly a winning issue.
And one of those terms, net zero, it has become increasingly debated over in the past few months. Net zero is central to climate policy and corporate strategy. It's backed by science, but it doesn't necessarily connect with many audiences. Should organizations rethink the language they use? And if so, what should they replace it with so that the scientific part of it does not get watered down, greenwashed?
Well, the data is very clear on 2 things. One, nobody knows what we're talking about. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, what a great day for decarbonization. People think Scope 3 is a mouthwash, and they don't know what net zero is. The average citizen on the planet thinks that the UN's target for temperature increase is 4 degrees centigrade. Okay, so people aren't sitting around talking about methane or GHGs or emissions or net zero. They're thinking about their daily lives. They are concerned about their kids' future. They are concerned about an overheating planet. They're concerned about their bills going up. They're concerned about their air conditioning costs and their home insurance costs. But net zero is a little bit like ESG. We have a phrase that we use at Potential Energy: when you're explaining, you're losing, and people don't know what it is. We did a big poll on ESG, and we asked citizens, what does ESG stand for? And somebody said eggs, sausage, and grits, which is breakfast in the American South. And net zero is somewhat similar. There's a phrase we use, empty terms make easy targets. So if it doesn't have a lot of definition in the voter's mind, it's easy to deposition it. But if you talk about the need for significantly less pollution, you have a significantly greater support. So I can get you 20 points of support just by changing your words, and that's the objective of the research, is actually to use the words that actually resonate with people. Turns out it's not a problem with the concept of dramatically reducing pollution. It is a concept with the term and the phrase.
In addition to misinformation or not providing appropriate clarity around terms, there's also silence in the sector, which has only grown in the past few months, maybe driven by policy, maybe driven by regulation, which some would say is making matters worse. What do you think are the risks of talking less about climate change at a time when its impacts are becoming increasingly visible?
Yeah, I have a data-driven point of view that it is folly to do climate hushing. But it's a real thing. Bloomberg did a study where the number of mentions of climate change in earnings reports has gone down by 75%. So it's a real phenomenon. I think it began in the United States, but it's traveling to other countries. I think it's come to the UK, and it may be coming to other places. There's a perception that climate isn't important to people, which is not supported by the data. I think that perception can happen if it's not messaged well. But the actual direct consequences, like the heat wave we're standing in right now on the streets of London, matter a lot to people. And if you talk about the consequences rather than the concept, and if you talk about the cause, which is pollution, rather than a distant concept of global warming or climate change, you have a significant amount of public support. The problem is we're in a little bit of a self-defeating cycle, where if you don't talk about it enough, then it does decline in terms of its salience, and it declines in terms of its salience, people talk about it less. And so there's a real need to connect with people in different ways and with different words.
And how do you think climate advocates should connect with people on climate messaging in a way that it is related to competing pressures as well, so geopolitical tensions, economic uncertainty, cost of living crisis? How do climate advocates bring all these different challenges and crises together in one sort of messaging?
Yeah. Well, you ask about what I think the answer is. The data is very clear on this. We tested dozens of different messages to see which message most increases your support for the policies that we need. And so that could range from climate change creates good jobs or economic competitiveness to it's important for justice. And the messages that always rise to the top fit into three categories. And these categories are all consequence messages. They're actually the consequences of an overheating planet are affecting you as a citizen. So one is your kids and their future. The second is your health. And the third is your money. So we talk about love, health, and money as the three big messages. We haven't seen economic concepts like you're going to get a green job or your country is going to be more competitive do very well, to be honest. Those are important to business and political leaders for various reasons. But if you want to have somebody support what you need, you talk about their families, talk about their money, and talk about their health. And that matters significantly. The highest performing messages we've seen in our advertising tests have recently been climate change is skyrocketing your home insurance rates. And when you relate it to your direct pocketbook issues, people can make the connection. And it moves them to support policy action in a very, very significant way.
Businesses are increasingly grappling with how to communicate sustainability without facing accusations of greenwashing or political backlash as well. Regulation around green comms has doubled in the past few months. Based on your research, what advice would you give to companies trying to engage employees, customers, and investors on climate issues?
Yeah, so I used to be a brand consultant helping big brands reposition themselves. And you would look at different attributes and you would say, is this attribute accretive to your brand or dilutive to your brand? So we did a major brand study where we looked at to what extent are environmental communications helpful or not helpful. And for employees, for investors, and for customers, being good on climate change was accretive universally to brands, both corporate brands and financial services brands. So it's a good thing. It adds brand value and it adds preference. I would say the second thing is customers and employees can sniff out exaggeration pretty easily. And so candid communication about being on a journey for less pollution, being on a journey to make progress on clean energy, and then talking about it as a business issue. Not that we're doing it because we have a particular set of values, but because it's good for managing risk and it's good for creating return, and that clean energy is a winning industry and that climate change creates economic risk. And so smart business people address climate change and the pollution issues because it's good for business. And so we really believe re-anchoring it in business as opposed to social cause is important. And ESG is also a tricky one to communicate. We advocate calling it responsible business and just saying, yeah, it makes good business sense from a risk and return point of view for you to take more responsible business practices.
Thanks, Sean. To wrap it up, if climate advocates, businesses, and policymakers could change one thing about how they talk about climate action tomorrow, what do you think would have the biggest impact on public engagement?
Well, I'm a marketer, and the first thing a marketer needs to do is deeply listen to your customers. And what I can tell you is they have no idea what the hell you're talking about. So kill the jargon, kill the technical speak. We've overcomplicated it. Think about the top 3 or 4 things that matter most in people's lives, your customers, your employees, your investors, and relate environment and climate issues to those, and talk like a human.
It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much, John. I hope you enjoy London.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here, and I'm heading inside for the air conditioning.
Perfect. Bye.
Thanks very much again to John for his time and for braving the heat of the streets of London. That brings all of our guest interviews to an end for today's episode. Thanks very much again to everyone who shared their insights for today's episode. We've still got a lot of content coming out in terms of LCAW roundups, some of the key takeaways that we've gathered throughout the week. And next week, we've also got a webinar coming up where we will be able to break down some of the key insights from this week. So Matt, tell us a little bit more about who you'll be speaking to next week.
Absolutely. So we're doing a kind of reflections webinar on some of the key talking points around LCAW, specifically in the energy space. There was so much that happened, so much to talk about, especially with the CCC report that came out in the middle of the week as well. So we appreciate it's hard to kind of keep up to date with London Climate Action Week and what was said, what was done, what was announced, whether it makes a real difference, to my point at the start of this episode. So on the 1st of July, we are hosting a webinar with Evolve Energy, who are obviously the sponsors for this podcast as well, which is looking at lessons from London and how to turn the discussions here into information and insight that can help with long-term energy strategies. Given the message that I received at the Opportunity Summit from the speakers there that electrification is happening, decarbonisation of the grid is happening, flexibility and storage are going to be needed, what does that mean for corporate energy strategy? So we'll be really delving into that with some reflections from people that were involved and at the events as well. So alongside James Hall, who's the COO of Evolve Energy, as one of the speakers, I'll be talking to Mike Pearce, Executive Director for Systems Change at the Climate Group, who are obviously one of the key organisations behind London Climate Action Week. And Dr. Sally Urin, the Executive Director and Chief Acceleration Officer at Forum for the Future. So some very familiar names for our audience there, but they'll be on hand to dissect the 100 of events and thousands of delegates and the panel discussions that took place, and hopefully kind of come out with a coherent set of signposts for businesses as how to respond and get to grips with energy ahead of, you know, what we know that's coming down the line with GHG protocol changes to Scope 2 reporting, what we've just seen with the net zero standard come out as well. So all change in the energy space, and this webinar will equip viewers with insight to deliver.
Okay, perfect. That's all for today's episode, but make sure you're subscribed wherever you normally get your podcasts, because for the next episode of Sustainability Uncovered, we'll be coming to you from our Edie summer lunch, and we'll be talking more about that resilience piece and how businesses can make sure they're prepared for the energy transition and then also for climate change. But for today, it's a goodbye from Sidhi.
Goodbye.
It's a goodbye from Matt.
Goodbye.
And it's a goodbye from me. Goodbye.